I love having a podcast because when I meet interesting people out in the wilds, I have a reason to follow up with them months later and have another great conversation, and you get to listen in. So, even the better. Without any further delay, may I introduce this week's guest? Today's guest is a remarkable leader in inclusion and diversity. She's the co founder and CEO of Transformation Journeys Worldwide, a global consultancy dedicated to fostering fully trans and gender expansive, inclusive organizational cultures. With a keen focus on transgender and gender expansive matters, she has received accolades for her tireless advocacy work from the likes of Georgia Diversity Council, Emory's University's Barkley Forum for Deliberation, Debate, and Dialogue, the Georgia Division of the U.S. Small Business Administration, among many others. She has served in various leadership roles, including as co-chair of the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce's TGX initiative and the Trans Affairs Committee on the City of Atlanta's LGBTQ Mayoral Advisory Council. Her contributions have been recognized by organizations and publications such as the Atlanta Business Chronicle and Forbes. She's a TEDx speaker and the author of Embrace Your Truth, A Journey of Authenticity, a book that combines memoir and self-help to inspire authenticity in others. Her dedication to creating authentic, empowering, and respectful spaces for all people, regardless of their gender identities and expressions, makes her a true trailblazer in the quest for inclusivity. Please join me in welcoming Gabrielle Claiborne. Welcome, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Robbie. I'm so excited about being with you all here today.
You're impressive on a number of levels beyond I even knew. Welcome, and thanks for joining us from your home in Atlanta, Georgia. As you know, this is a network podcast about building strong networks, and the context is leadership. So tell me, how do you define leadership, and when did you realize you had the skills to lead?
Well, Robbie, I've been a leader for much of my life, especially in the business world. But what I didn't realize until about 13 years ago is that there was an undeniable connection between authenticity and purposefulness. And so, what I learned as a result of coming out as a transgender 13 years ago, almost 14 years ago now, was that, to be a leader, you have to first be authentic. It was when I started living my life authentically that doors of opportunity started opening up for me. And the more I leaned into these spaces, it required me to be not just a traditional leader as we know it today, but an authentic leader. So I learned the importance of being courageous in how I led, being vulnerable in how I led, understanding that I had to do my own work around lack mentality and that I needed to recognize the value and importance of being able to elevate others. Those are just a few aspects of what I call an authentic leader. And I have actually put together a keynote on authentic leadership, Robbie, where I talk about certain those attributes and I break those down a little further so that folks can understand the connection between authenticity and purposeful living.
I love the way you're describing this and how you're woven your story into your definition. That makes so much sense to me. I'm thinking back, we were recording this in January of 2024. This is my 20-year anniversary of my first hormone shot. So 20 years ago,
Congrats.
September would have been when it like all hit the fan and I had to make a decision.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no. So it's great. I also talk often about how everything I've created since is because of that decision to get out of my own head and make it about other people and make space for other people in my life. And
Yeah.
so I'm actually kind of curious though what you were like as a kid, because that's the foundation of who you are today and the courage you had to come out 13 years ago. So when you're growing up, were you the one organizing kids in the playground? Or are you sitting quietly reading in the corner? Did you run for student office or join after school clubs? Did teachers recognize your aptitudes? Like, what kind of kid were you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Robbie. I think with every kid, they try to find, what is their lane, right? How are they going to show up in the world? And, as I grew up in a very conservative faith tradition home. I'm a fourth generation Pentecostal preacher's kid. And because I grew up in that environment, there was a lot that I had to work through, right? Especially when it came to my identity as a transgender woman. There's a lot of guilt and shame that I had to navigate, and that was hard. And I know that, many folks in our community have similar journeys that they had to travel. But, when I was a kid, I was an athlete, I was a good student, I was kind of considered the big man on campus, popular with the girls, popular with the in crowd. And, if you looked at my life on the outside, Robbie, you would say this person has life by the tail. But what they didn't know that was going on in the background of my life was this internal gender dilemma, which, I didn't have words to describe to anyone. And it was moving through life that I started to recognize and connect with something that I didn't even have the language at that time. I'm not going to tell you how far back that was because, a girl never gives her age away, right?
Until you pass 85, and then I think it's just a testament of survival.
Yeah. So, but it was like coming to terms with a lot of things that the culture and the space that I was raised to believe, raised in, to basically saying, you don't have a right to exist because it's wrong, it's sinful. It's, all of those, negative connotations around how you should show up. And so consequently, Robbie, while I showed up confidently, it was clearly a mask. It was a way of coping with probably the biggest secret of my life, and that was who I knew myself to be.
So 2 quick questions. 1, location, geography, where were you growing up?
I'm an Atlanta native, and I still live in Atlanta. There was a season in my vocational career where I went up the East Coast and back down, but I'm back in Atlanta where I've always been and should be.
Great. And you painted a picture of your Pentecostal upbringing, very conservative values in the household.
Yeah.
At what age did you start to realize that you and your sort of body and mind weren't meshing? I'm not sure you would have had language around gender per se, but when
Right.
did it start to feel off, even though you were presenting to the outside world as like this boy next door, popular kid,
Right.
you had it all together. The mask was really working for you. But when did you start to realize you even needed a mask?
Around the age of 8, Robbie, I had this unusual attraction to dress in women's clothes when no one was home at my house. When my mom and dad and sister were away from the home, my mom's closet was calling my name. And so I would go to my mom's closet and I would dress in her clothes. And for some reason, Robbie, I felt at peace when I did this, but for the life of me, I couldn't understand why. So it was at that young age, young, tender age, that I knew something was a little adrift with me. Okay. And, I think a lot of times folks think that, LGBTQ plus people, specifically trans and gender expansive folks, we choose to be who we are. But I argue the fact that how can an 8-year-old boy who has had no exposure to this, okay, be drawn to something that was considered misaligned from culture's perspective? And so, it wasn't until I started leaning into these desires and these urges that I started to reconcile for brief moments, Robbie, of feeling that internal and external alignment that I needed and wanted in my life for so long. And when I would go, but here's the thing: when I would go and dress in my mom's clothes, I would have this sense of exhilaration, but also this sense of guilt and shame because of how I was raised, the environment that I was raised in. So you can see the dichotomy that I was grappling within my own mind and my heart about, who am I?
I have an 8-year-old. I can't imagine my 8-year-old having to grapple with that. I also have a 6-year-old. So it's like these are early ages, and I know how early, even now, we are able to really have children recognize their gender at 4 or
Right.
5. In fact, I remember my oldest, who is identified as a boy at birth, telling us he was a boy when he was 2.5.
Yes.
What do you want to be when you grow up? A boy?
Yes, exactly.
I was
Yeah.
like, right, because you know that about yourself. Like that is a given thing. We didn't teach you that.
Yes.
This
And
is
Robbie, oh, by the way, it
mhm.
never went away.
Yeah, and it never went away. So again, like the environment didn't take it out of you. You were hiding it stealthily, with a sense that you couldn't be safe if you brought it out into the world. When did you start to find people that you could be with, and how did that kind of? I guess the other part of that question I always want to know is like, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up, as far as like jobs? Did you have like was your family maybe gearing you? Was first of all, was college even a given? Did you have a 12-year-old dream of being blank? And how does the gender conversation happening in your head sort of color that desire?
Well, I'll go back to when I was a kid. And, I didn't want to play with G.I. Joes and all those, figures, those hero figures. I wanted to play with Barbie. And I didn't understand why I didn't want to just play Barbie. I wanted to be Barbie, Robbie. And now I am. Now, I think for me, just just grappling with, how can I show up in the world being a good student, a talented athlete, a popular guy? How can I show up in a world that would accept me and accept the gifts that I bring to it? I mean, my dad was in construction for much of his life in addition to being a preacher. And so naturally, I had the privilege and honor of having a great education. I went to Emory University and I was a pre-med student. I then was waitlisted 2 years for medical school. So I fell back on my math degree. Don't ask me how I got to a math degree with pre-med, but I did. I fell back on my math degree and went to tech and got a civil engineering degree. So I went into construction because my dad was in construction. I had been exposed to it all my life. And, so I spent 30 years vocationally owning multiple businesses in the construction industry. And oh, by the way, I was very successful in this work. But all the while, all of this stuff was going on in the background. And Robbie, it wasn't until the internet came on the scene when I was 45 years old, and I stumbled across a website showing pictures of trans women. And immediately, we all know in the community representation matters. But immediately when I saw those images, I said, that's me. So this set me on the course of, doing the research of understanding, okay, can I be me? What does it mean for me with my family, with my career, with my spiritual community, with my circle of friends? What does it mean to me and for me if I make the decision to say yes to my yes? And so, when I saw myself first time there, it was still years after that before I took those first courageous steps in the direction of my yes.
But that means you spent, 37 years not having language for it,
Absolutely. I
except
mean,
for the
I
language of sin or things like that. Like you had negative language, but you didn't have any positive language.
I didn't know what I didn't know, Robbie, you
Hmm.
know? And language is powerful because it gives us a means of contextualizing something that, for so long, as it was in my case, for so long, it felt out of reach to me, right? But language brought that closer to me and it allowed me to kind of consider and grapple at new levels with who I really was.
Hmm. Now, in this time, in this 30 some odd years, relationships, family, how did you partner with people? Think about that. I mean, given that you had this conversation going on in your head.
Yeah. Well, I married a beautiful woman. We had three amazing kids. They're all in their 30s now, and I don't want to see anybody doing math in your head. Uh, but as I moved through that marriage, Robbie, what I did not understand is that I learned since that the reality that is that we are as sick as our secrets. And because I kept this secret of who I was from my spouse, from my parents, from my kids, I was actually building a foundation on sinking sand. I was building relationships that were built on deception and deceit. And it's not because I intentionally wanted to do this. I didn't know how to do this, as well as I felt like if I ever made the decision to be me, then I would lose every one of them. And since coming out, I have not spoken to my parents for 14 years, Robbie. And I know this is the reality for many LGBTQ plus people. And it's not because I haven't attempted to connect with them. It's because they have refused to extend my request to connect. And I think I understand why they have refused to connect with me. And that is because it challenges everything that they were raised to believe as right and Christian like in their life. So turning their back on their beliefs would mean accepting me would mean require them to turn their back on their beliefs. And that's something that some people can do, others can't. The journey that I've had with my now ex-wife, it's not been a straight line, Robbie. It's been a very difficult road to travel. I mean, there was a lot of, as you can imagine, coming out, 30 years into our marriage, she felt like, wow, did you really love me? Is our marriage a lie? All of these questions she had to grapple with on her own. She had to grieve the loss of the person that she thought she knew and somehow figure out a way to embrace with who I was and was becoming, because we share 3 kids together, right? So it wasn't a straight line for her, and it's taken almost 14 years for us to get to the place where we're actually communicating and at a friendship way. My youngest daughter got married a month ago in December of last year, and we had the opportunity to celebrate that meaningful and milestone moment together. But if that would have happened years before, there was no way that I would have been able to be a part of that. So and then with my kids, Robbie, it depends on what day you ask me, depends on how they're showing up for me.
Mhm.
My youngest daughter's been my biggest advocate. My oldest 2 kids, my daughter and son, have had greater challenges with their journey around my transition. But over time, they're trying to find ways to understand what the new form of our relationship could look like.
Once you break out of the expected roles, the unquestioned roles that society gives us, it
Yeah.
does break open every other question about who you should be. How else has this journey really rocked you? Like, do you find yourself changed as a leader, changed as a a white ally, like male privilege? Like, how else are you seeing the world differently because you said no to the box that you had been assigned, and you said, "I'm going to embrace who I really feel like I am." What else has been transformative about it?
Well, I learned how much privilege I had as a man. And when I transitioned to a woman, I realized quickly that, those same privileges, those same benefits, I now have to fight for on a whole new level, in a whole new way, right? I don't have access to certain rooms now that I had access to before. And, it's not that, it's not that that kept me from being me, but it was a reality that kind of became uh, aware to me, not knowing what I didn't know before I transitioned. And when you step into a new space and you get different results, you're thinking, "Whoa, this is different. What's going on here?" Right? So I grappled with that. I grappled with learning how to do business as a woman instead of a man. And those are 2 different scenarios, right? When I was a man, it was all about, you know, kicking you know what and taking names. And as a woman, I'm now more collaborative, and I'm bringing folks in and helping them be a part of the solution, more collaborative, right? More more interested in building teams to be a part of the solution, as opposed to just saying, this is the way we're going to do this. You either get on board or you know, go somewhere else. And so learning how to do business like that, that was an adjustment for me. You know, I think one of the beautiful things that I've experienced, one of the positives that have experienced, is dating as a woman. You know, while it's been very difficult to date in a completely different gender, in my mid 50s, it's been a rewarding experience to finally be the woman in the relationship, right? And that could have never happened in the previous scenario, right? So there have been growing edges, there have been challenges, but there's also been some benefits in being authentic, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're not constantly having to wonder how people are reacting and why would they love you if they knew you, and
Yeah,
like that whole sense of, like you said, building relationships on sinking sound and shifting sounds. I remember in college coming to the sort of realization that um I've always been outspoken, and depending on whether you were on my side or not was whether or not you thought I was like a strong voice or the B word. And
yeah,
then when I started taking hormones, decade later, or not quite a decade later, I started to realize that my voice carried weight in a different way now, and I
yes,
didn't wanna be that guy, the one who mansplained to women, and I had to actually change my approach to be in a space that I wanted to be in, and I tirelessly worked at that, and I now spend most of my time in rooms full of women, often women over 50 is, like, my crowd, and they always people reach out and say, like, "I love your energy." And I
yes,
think that wasn't you wouldn't have said that when this all started,
yes,
because in this presentation, my words would have definitely pegged me as the guy in the room who's kinda being a jerk, and other words that I don't wanna say on my podcast.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but it is interesting, like, not many people get to experience that sort of different points of view and perspectives and to kinda understand that, and it sounds like that's been part of your growth as well, and there's the benefit of really getting to be you and be seen for who you are.
yeah.
That's the plus of all of this.
Absolutely. And Robbie, I know the beautiful thing about transmasculine people's experience is that you all get to redefine what masculinity looks like. And consequently, you're bringing not only your authentic self, but you're bringing your lived experiences from the other perspective. And when you merge those two together, that is an ideal scenario, in my humble opinion, right? So thank you for leaning into that and recognizing that, and just seeing how you can, you know, merge both of those worlds together in a beautiful scenario that just kind of elevates folks instead of tears them down and separates them, you know?
I'm very fortunate that early in my journey, 20 years ago, I joined the National Organization for Men Against Sexism. They had a Boston chapter at the time, and I met the cisgender guys back before we even had the term, mostly straight guys who were examining their masculinity and what that meant in the
Um,
world. And it was a very welcoming space for me as an out trans guy. And it was helpful for me not to say, well, because I'm trans, I blank. It's
yeah,
like, no, I learned what it meant to be a feminist man and to live those ideals and to
right.
be, fighting for LGBT equality and racial justice, all of those things collectively. So, yes, I feel like my foundation in what manhood means was expansive as opposed to just being, archetypal, which is what I only had before that. I only had a few archetypes to even choose from, and they none of them sounded good to me.
Yeah.
Um, these are journeys, and I'm kind of curious how you went from 30 years in construction to the advocate that you are
Mm.
today, the champion for sort of gender inclusive and trans inclusive and gender expansive spaces. When did you realize you could use like your voice and your story to help in that sense. Like you don't have a background in nonprofit, you don't have
Right.
a background in advocacy. You were
Yeah.
like kind of under the radar, just doing your thing, working your job. So when did that start to shift? And was there someone in your life who helped be a guiding light around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first transitioned, Robbie, one of my fears was, will I be able to find a vocation that I could step into that could support me, right? That I could actually survive in our, at that time, and even now, trans unwelcoming world, right? And so consequently, what did I do? I fell back on my entrepreneurial experience and started a cleaning company and a home renovation company. And I did those vocational iterations for maybe 4 or 5 years in those early years of my transition. But you know what, Robbie? The more I leaned into being me, the authentic version of me, those vocational iterations no longer served me. They no longer fed me. I always had a desire and an aspiration to leave a legacy and to educate others. And so when I was in the early years of my transition, I was going to a church, a trans welcoming church here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I met at that time and a Methodist ordained minister who had come on staff at that church. And by the way, this church was predominantly LGBTQ plus, and she was cis and straight, but she was an ally. And so we struck up a friendship, and one thing led to another. And the more that she learned more about my story and learned about trans people, because when she met me, she had never met a trans person. She didn't know anything about what it meant to be trans. And over those next few years, as I shared my story and my lived experience with her, she said, Gabrielle, you would be an amazing advocate for this work. Would that interest you? And of course, when she said that, it sparked something within. It's like my heart leapt inside me, Robbie, when she said that. And so that began some very scary, courageous conversations of what does building an organization where we show up, where I show up, where she shows up as a cisgender ally, advocating for inclusion and diversity, for and justice for my demographic. And so almost now 8 years ago, that's when we started that conversation. And through those conversations, we built our consultancy, fledgling consultancy, and have grown to be a global organization over the last 8 years. And
Who
and again, Robbie, I feel like that, you know, purposeful living comes about only about once you showing up authentically. You cannot separate those two. And so the more I was authentic, it made sense why those early vocational iterations no longer worked for me. I had to step into a space that not only did I feel like I loved what I do, but I did what I love.
who were your early client prospects? So who were you trying to serve early on, and what was your original sort of mission for that work? Like, how did you sort of initially name that when you're putting your first shingle out?
Well, because she and I, my business partner, were coming from a spiritual space, we developed a workshop called Embrace Your Truth, The Journey of Authenticity, which became the foundation of my memoir. Okay. So we put together that training. It was like a 3-hour workshop, and it taught people how to live their most authentic life, regardless of their gender identity, sexual orientation, whatever, right? It was more of a general authentic conversation. And the more we leaned into this work, and showing up in spiritual spaces, we realized that a lot of spiritual spaces do not have the revenue, in order to support our work. So we recognized that the corporate space was more of the space to show up in. So we started showing up in spaces that our ideal client shows up in. And one thing led to another. We started building relationships with these potential clients. And at that time, Robbie, we were one of just a few organizations that was doing this work. In many ways, we were kind of, championing this work before it was even on anybody's radar. And we were trying to, convince folks, explain them why they need our services, right? So there was a lot of, business building that we had to go through to get to the place we are now. But those were the first early iterations. And, now we're showing up in the medical and mental health care space, in the municipality space, in the nonprofit space, in the educational space. There's many different markets that we're now showing up in, because quite honestly, this conversation is applicable to all walks of life, to all of those different markets.
So is this around 2015, 2016? When is this beginning to happen?
Yep. 2015 is when we hung our shingle out officially. And it wasn't until a year later that we started showing up in the corporate space. And we realized that, corporate organizations, they were starting at ground zero, and they didn't even know where to start or how to start this conversation. So that's when we started to develop curriculum to meet them where they are, because we recognized that it was very important to meet them where they are, speak to their pain points, help them understand and learn what they don't know that they don't know, to set them up for success as that ideal client. And that was a journey for them as much as it was for us.
Now, you said early on you didn't really have the connections per se, although you had your company connections from what you had done more of in the trade space. I
had my expertise as a business owner. That's what.
Yes, you did have that you brought with you, and the belief that you could do that. But then I'm thinking, like, walking in as a trans woman to a corporate space, a presumably mostly male-dominated corporate space, where you didn't have those introductions yet, but you knew that it was where your prospects were. And that feels brave, honestly, just listening to that, to think about where you started. But if you hadn't done that, like everything else you've done, you would have limited your potential. So I partly want to draw that out of the story, because anyone listening, like, sometimes you've got to make big leaps. Now, you're fortunate you had this amazing business partner to hold you up, right? And to, like, be there with you, so you didn't have to go it alone. But what were some of those first introductions and forays? And did anyone really break the door open for you and get you your first few clients, or become repeat clients, or great referral partners? Like, how did you initially get your foot, like, in that door and push that door open?
In 2014, Robbie, I saw a life coach for a year. And that life coach taught me how to get out of here and into here, right?
From your head to your heart.
In my head to my heart. And the more I started leaning into that, more doors opened up for me. I started volunteering with the Pride organization here in Atlanta, which is the largest Pride in the Southeast. I was elevated to an executive leadership level within that organization. And as a result of being in that space, when I had the opportunity to do trainings within that Pride organization across the US and across the globe. And so this kind of positioned me for these types of conversations. So when the corporate partners and sponsors of the Pride organization would call the Pride organization and say, "Hey, we're looking for a trans speaker. Do you have someone?" By the way, we do. And so one thing led to another, opened the door for me to step in some spaces that I had only dreamed, Robbie, of showing up in. I'll never forget my first corporate client in 2016. I'm sitting there in the lobby as my authentic self, scared to death, but exhilarated, on the other side of those emotions. And when I walked in and was able to share my story and speak from a place of experiential knowledge and just understanding of all I had gone through up to that point, people were like hanging on every word. And it was at that moment, Robbie, I realized that people inherently, they want to do right and be the best version that they can be. They just need to be shown how to do that. And so that was just the beginning of that journey that we embarked in with corporate clients. And I will tell you one thing that I've learned, and this is something that I reference in my TED talk, is that, anytime we do something new, that first step is the hardest step because it is the scariest step to take. Because here's the thing, when you take a step, that first courageous step, you don't even know if it's the right step. You don't know what's going to happen after that step. There's all of these unknowns, and right. So, I encourage folks to, when your heart is leading you in a certain direction, take that courageous step, because then those next steps unfold.
I'm really glad I dug a little bit to figure out how you unlock this, because strategic volunteering sounds like it really was the answer.
Yeah.
You started showing up. If you ever want to get on the board of a local group, just show up, say yes to the things you can do, and do them without being reminded, and you'll be president within a year. Like, it's like, boom. Like, we need
Yeah.
people who will actually do what they say they'll do. This is amazing.
Yeah.
I
And
actually have
we give permission, for folks to do the same thing, Robbie, when we show up that way. So yeah.
Brilliant. So I think that, you being in the position of a leadership role at this large Pride organization that was organizing all the Pride festivities for Atlanta, which is an enormous, it's a huge area, right? You're covering a large expanse. It's got a lot of major corporations that are that have headquarters there. And so it makes sense that helped you step out of just like the general audience of people, even the other people doing LGBT inclusion work at the time, because you had that role that immediately elevated you and made it easier for people to spot who you were and engage with you and believe that you had the professional connections, at least, to be invited in for an opportunity. And then, of course, you followed through and did a great job, which then leads to other referrals. And did you start initially figuring out this is within the world of corporate, that's very expansive, but was there a particular sector that you started to focus in on, or in the beginning before you started expanding out? Was there some place that you felt this is where we want to have an impact and we know people in this space?
This is what I learned. This is what we learned as we built our business. And that was that, and this is what I share with aspiring entrepreneurs who want to start their own business. And that is, that I recommend that you need to know who your ideal client is. Who are the services, where are your services most used and needed? Who is that client? Identify that first step. Then you find out where they show up, right? And so a lot of inroads into these corporations that we wanted to work with were who happened to be Fortune, 100, 500 companies, were through their ERGs, were through their DEI department, were through their HR, talent acquisition. These were our typical inroads into organizations. And when we recognized that, we started stepping in spaces that they were showing up in. We started developing curriculum to meet them where they are, to help them understand and learn what they didn't know that they didn't know. And what we learned early on is that recognizing an organization's pain points and speaking to those pain points goes a long way in elevating you as a supplier of choice. And that is one of the lessons that we learned, Robbie, just getting our foot into the door. Yeah, we had these aspirations to do this work with, global organizations, but we didn't start there. We started with local organizations, and referral after referral after referral, a new website, a robust curriculum after 8 years just kind of positioned us to now step into that global space.
Has your team expanded over time? Have you had to add certain resources to grow? I mean, you were starting out already with 2 of you, which is better than most people who start out with just themselves as the idea generator and doer. But how did you figure out where you needed support and what kind of support to get?
Well, in our work and our diversity, equity, and inclusion work, Robbie, we recognized pretty quickly that intersectionality was very essential in making sure that we're having the conversations in the most equitable way that we can have them, right? And so consequently, my business partner's white, I'm white, so we're not bringing the intersectionality that's relevant in the lived experiences of the width, breadth, and depth of our community. So we started a partnership with a biracial trans woman who is an HR professional, and started including her and interfacing her into our trainings with our clients. Our clients started asking for her over me and my business partner, which we were so grateful for, because she brings that intersectional perspective that we don't bring. So yeah, recognizing that you need to make sure that the voice that you're using and the content that you're presenting covers the width, breadth, and depth of the lived experiences of the community that you're advocating for. We also built an alliance partner with a Black non-binary agender person who uses no pronouns, who is a certified dietitian. And Dahlia brings that perspective to our conversations. And so we've done a number of sessions with Dahlia, and being able to put Dahlia in front of our clients this is what it does. It positions us for greater opportunity, because as we recognize the importance of making sure the right voices are in the room and around the table, our clients are recognizing the same thing, and they're asking for that. So being able to provide them that, sets us up as kind of like that go-to organization.
I love the organic growth. I love the fact that you're also you're thinking about who needs to be there, and then you also are building the relationships authentically to invite them in.
Yes.
So they're not just
And
another checkbox
and
in the room.
yeah, and equitably. That's
Right.
important as well.
So we're about to wrap up and get to my final question. But before we do, I wanted to ask you if you have any particular habits, philosophies, or practices that help you stay in touch with your greater network, not just the people you work with currently, but the people you see once a year at a conference like the one we met at,
Yeah.
or people you worked with 5 years ago, but haven't had a reason to since, but you like each other, you enjoy each other's company. Do you have anything that kind of helps you stay in connection?
Yeah, Robbie, I feel like one of our superpowers as human beings is visibility. And I feel like that if you want to be successful in whatever you're doing, you have to elevate your visibility in many different places, right? So I am visible on social media. I am visible in virtual trainings. I'm visible in TED Talks. I'm visible by having a published book. I'm visible in in-person conferences that I speak at. I'm visible in nonprofit organizations that I volunteer for. Visibility, visibility, visibility is the greatest thing for success, much like location, location, location is in real estate, right? The more we're visible, the more people are going to recognize what they don't know that they don't know, and they're going to lean in and say, how can I do and be better? So I think our visibility is our superpower. So visibility is at the top of my list there.
I love it. We're about to get to my wrap up question. Before we do, we're gonna have a quick word from our sponsor. All right. So here's my wrap up question. A year from now, we are back in touch, and I hope we don't have to wait a year for that. I'm
Yeah.
delighted to be reconnected with you. And I asked you, what are you celebrating from the past year? So I want to know, what are we going to be toasting to your success? What are you most looking forward to in the year ahead?
What I'm looking forward to in the year ahead is being able to stand on stages that I've never been on before, stages where trans people have never been on before, because I feel like, as we start showing up and owning our authenticity and our uniqueness and our power and our expertise in these spaces, and we elevate the conversations to a level of recognizing us as the just another facet of the human family, that's when we're going to start seeing that, when one of us hurts, all of us hurts. When one of us excels, all of us excel. So I want to be on stages that I've never been on. I want to push myself to spaces that I'm uncomfortable in being in, all for the benefit of elevating the width, breadth, and depth of humanity.
It's amazing. I can't wait to celebrate that with you. And of course, help and encourage you along the way. How can people find you and follow your work?
You can find me at our website at transformationjourneys.www.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. I have a YouTube channel at Transformation Journeys WW. Find us there as well.
Fantastic. We're going to put all those links. Plus, we have your link to your TEDx and your book at our website on theschmooze.com. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. It's been quite a delight.
Thank you, Robbie.